That man's a machine.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go.
Good morning and welcome to Tech, an insight into new media. Today I'll be covering how streaming and video games have evolved from when they first started to what they now represent in modern society. Okay, so first, let's talk about streaming and how it came to be what we see today. Let's start with a very simple question. What is streaming? Well, streaming is commonly seen in the form of audio and video streaming, in which a multimedia file such as an MP4 is being played to a person either live or not fully downloaded by use of the internet. I'm going to go over how the streaming of movies, with the use of services such as Netflix, Hulu, and others, has had an impact on the DVD industry. It's no doubt that in recent history, DVDs have not been selling as well as they once did, and video stores such as Blockbuster are being considered irrelevant and soon to become obsolete in our society, due to the ease and popularity of streaming services from the internet. Funnily enough, one of the most popular streaming services, Netflix, that is considered the most popular streaming service in our modern society, founded in Scotts Valley, California, that launched on the 14th of April 1998, actually started as a company that delivered movies on DVD by mail from ordering them online, until 2007, when the company expanded to the multimedia streaming platform, which is the one we know today and is the most popular. Whilst still keeping the DVD rental available until February of the same year, they began to move away from the DVD business model and more towards streaming. Another popular media is video games. Video games have been around since October 1958, when physicist William Higginbotham, who created what is considered to be the first video game ever made. What is this game, you may ask? It was a very simple tennis game similar to the 70s arcade game Pong. Most video games were made as simulations for research and didn't reach mainstream popularity until the 1970s and 1980s, when arcades were introduced and games came to home consoles that used joysticks and buttons, and even some home computers that could run them. Video games have been majorly popular since the 80s and have become part of our mainstream culture. One of the earliest games, Space War, developed in 1962 by a pair of computer scientists in Northern America. Although the game had good reception, it was not popular due to the popularity of other games such as the tennis and Pong clones that followed. Early arcade games were developed from 1972 to 1978. During the 70s, the first generation of home consoles released, including games like Pong and various clones of that game, and old arcade games ported to these said consoles. The golden age of arcade games, considered to be the peak of popularity of them, took place from 1978 to 1982. This included games such as Pac-Man, Centipede, Donkey Kong Space Invaders, and many more. Arcades back in the late 70s and early 80s were very common to find in shopping centres around the world. The first ever home console to reach Northern America was the Magnavox Odyssey, released in September 1972 by the Magnavox company. Although it was a big leap from arcades, it was very basic, featured little to no cover, and had very few games. But it was on the 11th of September 1977 that the popular video game console released. What is that console, you may ask? The Atari 2600, or previously known as the Atari Video Game Computer System, which was an affordable alternative to arcades, where you would usually pay in coins to play turns of games. This was the first of its kind. This would allow you to insert game cartridges and play the game you wanted without limits. The system launched to high success and included 2 joysticks and a copy of the game Combat with 8 others available separately, and ported over popular arcade games such as Pac-Man and Comet. The gaming business was booming until 1983, when the great video game crash of '83 struck. Due to an oversaturated market, sales went down from a whopping $3.2 billion in 1983, then fell around to a mere $100 million by 1985. Now keep in mind that's almost a 97% drop that brought an abrupt end to the industry and even caused several companies who made consoles and home computers to shut down. But a couple years later, when it was seeming hopeless, the market recovered mostly due to the widespread success of the Nintendo Entertainment System, popularly shortened to the NES, which was soft-launched, which means released to very few people for a test run, in New York in late 1985, and had become immensely popular in North America and other countries when released in 1987. With companies wanting to project sales, the majority of the audience back then were children and teenagers who'd most likely played these games in an arcade, spent countless coins, and when found out these games were becoming to home consoles, would beg their parents and convince them to buy them a console. Companies like Nintendo and Atari targeted their products at children, as most of their players included children. That's why games like Pac-Man was such a success back in the late 70s, because not only did the game play and look great, but the simple gameplay, unique ideas, and non-black and white color scheme attract adults to play, but millions of children as well. And due to the addictive nature of all video games, kids were the most determined to do well at the game. Most arcade games focused on the achievements of getting the high score and beating other people's high scores, which may explain why the game was considered to have such an addictive nature. Now, this does reflect back on modern society, where it's considered to be good at a game if you're the best, beating other people's scores and becoming number one. We see this a lot in now tournaments of video games considered like esports or local tournaments held to play video games between an elite specialty of players who achieve to try and get the high score in said game. It isn't until after these said consoles released that the more popular genres began showing themselves, such as first-person shooters with the release of Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, showing great graphics, good gameplay mechanics, and a positive color scheme that attracted most players to develop a liking for the first-person shooter genre, which led to other companies copying this. Early games such as Medal of Honor started being shut out by other companies such as Call of Duty and Battlefield, who were fighting to have their first-person shooter be the best on the market and project sales way beyond what they could have back in the 80s. Although this was probably the prime example of a physical media switching to a digital, it's not the first time this has happened. In fact, DVD once wasn't the biggest thing around and ended up replacing something much like it was replaced by Netflix. I'm of course talking about VHS media format, which stands for Video Home System. It was a standard consumer level video recording on tape cassettes, mainly sold by companies such as Blockbuster in the 90s. In the end, DVD came out on top of VHS and became the most popular one, further eliminating the competition, much like Netflix is now doing this to DVDs. In the last few years, the popularity of games have not only circled around children, but now some adults and younger adults. These include characteristics that can be shared among gamers, such as being efficient. Every gamer has that one level where he or she knows that special move needed to skip an encounter. Others could include being dynamic, ready to reassure yourself at any moment. New experiences could demand reworking of strategies, changing of skills, or even an analysis of enemies. Others include innovative, dexterous, sometimes even childish, because where would gaming be without childish creativity? It can be said that nothing has propelled competition more than the outrageous taunts of the victor. Although most of the games released in the 80s and 90s were primarily aimed towards children but still enjoyed by everyone, from the popularity of those games rose more adult-themed type games. For example, when Mortal Kombat released, parents were shocked to see the level of violence which had practically never been heard of before, because most of the games such as Pac-Man, Donkey Kong and Space Invaders featured no digital violence whatsoever and only a dynamic aim towards children. Although this was received negatively by parents who were concerned for their children, the companies were still very popular and continue making those games even to this day. Another franchise of games in question could be Grand Theft Auto. Grand Theft Auto is a long-running third-person shooter game that involves committing crimes such as murdering, doing drugs, carjacking, hence the name of the video game, but also has a dynamic story and memorable characters. Many parents just judge the game for having mindless violence, while others protrude that it's a great leap in the terms of gaming. Although the company has been under fire from many parents and political figures, it's still very popular and sells millions of copies of the game. Coming up next, we have an interview with a child psychologist to see what she thinks the influence of these games can do to the future of our children. Okay, now we're going to be calling child psychologist Claire Bennett to see her opinion on the matter.
Hello, this is Claire.
Hi Claire, I'm from the Tech and Insight into New Media podcast. Is it possible to have a few questions with you?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so today we're discussing streaming and violence in video games. So my first question for you is, what are your thoughts on video games that feature violence?
Look, I think that it doesn't matter what we do these days. There's always going to be violence, and, I think that perhaps we need to have ratings on games that show what sort of age level is appropriate for people to be playing these games. Violence isn't good, but it is part of the world that we live in these days.
Okay, good to hear. My second question for you is, do you think these games have any influence over children and will cause them to reenact what they see in these games?
It's funny because I think there's a lot of people out there that think that children and people who play these games are affected by them in a negative manner. And, obviously people are going to get frustrated when things don't go their way. However, I grew up watching things like Tom and Jerry, where they were running around killing each other and blowing each other's heads off, and then they sprang back to life. And my generation hasn't turned out to be a bunch of murderers running around killing each other just because we saw that on the telly when we were growing up.
Yep, very true. Okay, and for my last question, finally, do you agree with the current rating system we use for games, or do you think they should be easier going or harder on video games that feature violence in them?
No, I think that there's a very, very skilled and professional group of people who create these ratings, and they're not a hard and fast rule. The ratings are basically a guideline to say what generally we think is or is not acceptable for people to be watching or not watching, or playing or not playing. However, everybody's different, and some parents might believe that a game that's rated 18 is okay for their 16-year-old to play, and some parents who have a 9 or 10-year-old might think that a 15 game is okay for their children. But it's all down to the individual parents to make those choices. But I think as a whole, we do need some sort of a rating to give people a guideline of what we think is right or not right for people to be watching and playing.
Okay, thanks for answering our questions. We're going to end the show here. So thank you for answering our questions, Claire.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Okay, bye now. Okay, and that's all we have time for left on the show, so thank you for tuning into Tech and Insight into Technology.